The fluorescent lights in the courthouse hallway hummed in a way that made everything feel slightly unreal. I sat on a wooden bench outside courtroom 4B, my hands folded in my lap, watching my attorney flip through papers I'd already signed 3 times. My daughter Jennifer sat to my left, quiet in a way she'd never been quiet before. Not peaceful quiet, held breath quiet. I was 63 years old, and I was about to watch my 41-year marriage end in a room full of strangers. I kept thinking about my shoes. I bought them 2 weeks earlier, low heels, navy blue, sensible. I paid for them myself, from my own account, the small one I'd opened 6 months ago without telling my husband. That was the first time in over 4 decades I bought shoes without wondering if he'd ask how much they cost. It shouldn't have felt like freedom, but it did. His name was Walter. Is Walter. You don't stop being married to someone's name just because a judge signs a paper. Walter Crane. I used to love the way it sounded. Neat, solid, like furniture built to last. We met in 1982 at a church potluck in Columbus, Ohio. I was 22, recently graduated from Ohio State with a degree in accounting. I had a job offer from a firm in Cincinnati, a 1-bedroom apartment I was excited about, and a plan, vague in the way all young people's plans are vague, but mine, unmistakably mine. Walter was 28, charming in the way that men who know exactly how charming they are can be. He brought a green bean casserole his mother had made. I remember thinking that was sweet. We were engaged 8 months later. I turned down the Cincinnati job. He said it made more sense for us to stay in Columbus, where his business was. He said Cincinnati was too far. He said a lot of things that sounded like logic and felt like love, and for a very long time I could not tell the difference. I became Beverly Crane. I filed his taxes, managed his schedule, raised our 2 children, Jennifer and our son Michael, and kept a house so clean that his mother once said I should have been a hotel manager, and she meant it as a compliment. I was good at disappearing into other people's needs. I had a talent for it. What I gave up is harder to explain, because I didn't give it up all at once. That would have been too obvious, too clearly a loss. Instead, it went the way heat leaves a house in winter, slowly, through every small gap you never thought to seal. The accounting firm eventually stopped being something I mentioned. My name came off our joint account for simplicity. My college friends drifted, partly because I was busy, partly because Walter would get quiet in a particular way after I came home from seeing them. And quiet with Walter was never actually quiet. It was a weather system you had to manage for days afterward. So I stopped going. It was easier. By the time our children were in high school, I had learned to ask permission for things I had every legal right to do. By the time they left for college, I had mostly stopped wanting things at all. It was less painful that way. I told myself this was love. I told myself this was sacrifice, and sacrifice was noble. And what was a marriage if not 2 people giving things up for each other? I believed that for a very long time. What I didn't let myself look at clearly was the fact that I could not name one single thing Walter had given up. Not one. Jennifer knew. She'd known longer than I had, I think. Children see the architecture of a household more clearly than the people living in it. They see who shrinks when the car pulls into the driveway, who eats less when there's tension, who laughs differently when Dad's out of town. She never said it directly, not until much later, but she knew. Her daughter, my granddaughter. Her name is Nora, and she was 11 when all of this started, and 12 by the time it ended. Nora knew too. Children that age have a radar for injustice that adults spend years learning to tune out. Nora had not yet learned to tune it out. The divorce was Walter's idea. That part still makes people pause when I tell them. He filed in March. I found out from our attorney, our shared attorney, who was not actually neutral, a thing I did not understand until it was almost too late. Walter handed me the papers on a Tuesday evening after dinner. He'd waited until I'd cleaned up the kitchen. I remember thinking that was deliberate, though I still don't know if it was. He said we'd grown apart. He said it wasn't working. He said these things as though they were weather reports, factual and impersonal, as though 41 years were a lease that had simply come to term. What he did not say, what came out later, was that he had already spoken to a financial advisor about restructuring his assets. He had already begun moving money, slowly, carefully, in amounts just small enough not to trigger immediate concern. He had been planning this for at least a year. I know this because Nora told me, not directly. Nora told me in the way 12-year-olds tell you things, sideways, half accidentally, in the middle of something else. She was staying with me for a weekend in May, a few months after the papers were filed. We were making grilled cheese sandwiches, and she was telling me about a book she was reading for school, something about the American Revolution. She couldn't remember the author. And then she went quiet, the kind of quiet that means someone is deciding whether to say the thing they actually came to say. "Grandma," she said finally, "did you know Grandpa had lunch with Uncle Kevin last November? Kevin is Walter's younger brother, an accountant as it happens. We'd never been close. He had Walter's charm without Walter's discipline, which made him easier to like and harder to trust." I said I hadn't known that, no. Walter had told me he was in Dayton for a client meeting that week. Nora turned back to the sandwiches. She flicked them very carefully, the way I'd shown her. Then she said, "He talked about a lot of money stuff. I heard some of it. I didn't ask how." She was staying with Walter for a few days that same week, visiting her grandfather, because despite everything, she loved him, the way grandchildren love grandparents, with a loyalty that exists somewhat outside the truth of who those people actually are. She'd been doing homework in the den. The door was open. She was quiet. "Adults forget children are in the room. You should probably have a lawyer check everything," she said. She sounded like a 40-year-old. She sounded like someone who had been thinking about this for 6 months and had finally decided it was worth the risk of saying it. I hired a different attorney the following week. What that attorney found, working with a forensic accountant, was not subtle once you knew where to look. Walter had transferred significant assets into an LLC he'd formed 18 months earlier, a business entity I had never heard of that held real estate investments that had been quietly, legally structured to minimize what any court would count as marital assets. It was not illegal. That was the part that took me a long time to sit with. He had done something deeply dishonest with complete legal precision. It had a year's head start. The hearing was set for September. By then, I had my own attorney, my own forensic accountant, and a clarity about my marriage that I found both devastating and, oddly, stabilizing. Like finally seeing the shape of a room you'd been navigating in the dark for years. The furniture hadn't moved. You'd just been bruising yourself unnecessarily. Jennifer wanted to come. I said yes because I needed her there, and I'd finally gotten past the part of myself that said I shouldn't need anything. What I didn't know until the morning of the hearing was that Nora had asked to come too. Jennifer called me at 7 a.m. She said Nora had been awake since 5, already dressed, asking if she could ride along. She'd told her mother she wanted to be there for me. Jennifer had said no initially, then yes, then called me to ask if it was okay. I said of course. She was 12. I thought she'd sipped in the hall with a book. She did not sit in the hall. Courtroom 4B was smaller than I expected, given the weight of what happens inside those rooms. Wood paneling that had been painted over once too many times, windows with frosted glass, a flag in the corner that listed slightly to the left. Walter was already seated at his table when we came in. His attorney, a man named Henderson, very polished, very expensive, leaning close, murmuring something. Walter looked up when I walked in. He looked the same as he always had. That used to confuse me. I used to think something in a person's face would change when they did something worth changing for. My attorney had filed the documentation around the LLC. Henderson had filed objections. This was the hearing where the judge would decide whether those assets were relevant to the divorce settlement. If she ruled in Walter's favor, I would leave a 41-year marriage with a fraction of what was actually ours. The judge's name was Honorable Catherine Marsh. She had the kind of face that gives nothing away. Not unkind, not cold, just private, professional. I decided I liked her. We were perhaps 30 minutes in. Opening statements. A lot of procedural language I followed well enough thanks to my accounting background. When the door in the back of the courtroom opened, Jennifer had stepped out briefly, something with her phone, work. She came back in quietly. Beside her was Nora, still in her coat, her backpack over one shoulder. Jennifer guided her to our side of the room, into a seat in the gallery behind me. I reached back and squeezed Nora's hand. She squeezed back, then she leaned forward and whispered something to Jennifer. Jennifer's expression changed. Just slightly, not alarm, but something adjacent to it. She whispered back. Nora nodded. She pulled her backpack into her lap. I didn't know yet. I turned back to the front of the room. Henderson was in the middle of arguing that the LLC had been established for legitimate business purposes entirely independent of any anticipation of divorce proceedings, and that my attorney's forensic analysis represented speculation rather than Your Honor. The voice was clear, unhesitating, from the gallery. Judge Marsh looked up. Everyone looked up. Nora was standing. 12 years old, still in her coat, backpack held in front of her with both hands like a shield. Her chin was steady. She had Walter's jaw, actually. I'd always thought that. Strong. Set. I apologize for the interruption, she said. I have no idea where a 12-year-old learns to say that to a judge, but I have something that might be important. May I approach? Judge Marsh studied her for a moment. Henderson started to rise. Walter touched his arm. A reflex. Then Walter sat very still. Young lady, the judge said, not unkindly, who are you to these proceedings? I'm Beverly Crane's granddaughter, Nora said. And Walter Crane's granddaughter. She paused. I think what I have is relevant. I can explain why if you'd like. Judge Marsh looked at my attorney. My attorney looked at me. I had no idea what was in that backpack. I'll allow it, the judge said. Approach. Nora walked to the front of the courtroom with the steadiness of someone who had practiced this, or who was simply, constitutionally, not afraid of rooms full of adults. She unzipped her backpack and removed her phone, a regular phone, scratched screen, a sticker of a cartoon cat near the camera. She held it out to the clerk. I have a recording, she said, from last November. My grandfather and my great-uncle were talking at lunch. I was in the next room doing homework and I could hear them clearly. After a few minutes, I realized what they were saying and I started recording. I know I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry about that. She said this last part looking at me. Judge Marsh asked Henderson if he had any immediate objection to the court reviewing the content before ruling on admissibility. He had several objections voiced rapidly. The judge listened, then said she'd make that determination herself and asked the clerk to assist with playing the audio. Walter's attorney was on his feet again. Walter himself had not moved. He was looking at Nora with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter and more complicated than anger. If I had to name it, I would say it looked like the moment a person realizes they have miscalculated something significant. I heard Kevin's voice first, Walter's brother, that familiar, lazy drawl. Then Walter's voice, steady and deliberate even in a recording, saying the name of the LLC, saying a number that made my forensic accountant, seated behind me, sit forward, saying a date, saying what would be done before anything got filed. The courtroom was extremely quiet. When it ended, Judge Marsh set down her pen. She asked the clerk to make a copy. She asked Henderson to sit down. Then she looked at Nora, who had returned to her seat in the gallery and was sitting with her hands in her lap, very still. Thank you, the judge said simply. What followed took another 2.5 hours. Recesses, motions, Henderson arguing strenuously that a recording made by a minor without the knowledge of those being recorded was inadmissible. And he was correct that this is a complicated area of law, particularly in Ohio, which has a one-party consent statute. but Nora had been a party to that conversation in the sense that she was present in the house, and what the recording demonstrated was a pattern that my forensic accountant could now trace with considerably more direction. The recording itself might or might not be entered formally. The roadmap it provided was another matter. Walter's attorney requested a recess to consult with his client. They were gone for 40 minutes. When Henderson came back, he asked to speak to my attorney privately. They were in a side room for 20 minutes. When my attorney came back out, she sat down beside me and opened her folder and said, in a voice that was carefully neutral, that they wanted to discuss settlement terms. I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at Nora, who was reading something on her phone now, scrolling with her thumb, apparently very calm. "Tell them we're listening," I said. "The settlement took 3 more weeks to finalize. I don't share the specific numbers, not in general, but I will say that I walked out of that marriage with what was actually mine: the house, half the retirement accounts, a fair share of assets that had nearly been made to disappear." My attorney called it a significant outcome. My forensic accountant called it a good result, given where we'd started. I called it 41 years. I cried in the car afterward, in the parking garage while Jennifer drove. Not the way I expected to cry, not relief exactly, or grief exactly, or grief exactly. Something messier and more honest than either of those. Jennifer handed me a travel pack of Kleenex from her purse without saying anything, which was exactly right. Nora was in the back seat. She had fallen asleep. She is 13 now. She's in 7th grade and has opinions about everything, which is my favorite thing about her. Last month, she started a petition at her school to get more vegetarian options in the cafeteria. It's going well, she tells me. She has a very organized approach to persuasion. I asked her once, a few months after the hearing, whether she'd been scared. She thought about it for a while. She thinks before she answers, which she did not get from me or her mother, so I assume it skipped a generation. "Not scared," she said finally. "I just kept thinking, someone has to say something, and I was the one who knew." I moved into a 2-bedroom condo in Worthington in October. The mortgage is mine, the furniture I chose myself. There's a small 2nd bedroom I use as a study. I bought a drawing table for it, something I'd wanted since my 20s and had never let myself have, because Walter didn't see the point. It turns out I'm mediocre at drawing. I'm having a wonderful time. I signed up for a continuing education class at Columbus State, tax law, updated for current practice. I haven't worked as an accountant in 38 years. I'm starting to think about whether I could again, part-time. I'm 63, not dead. There is a considerable difference. My friend Carol, we've known each other since the kids were in elementary school. She'd been quietly furious on my behalf for years without ever pushing me. Said something to me recently that I keep turning over. She said, "I always knew you were still in there. I just didn't know how long it was going to take to get you out." I didn't know what to say to that. I'm still thinking about it. What I know is this: I wasted years being grateful for a life I had mostly built myself. I kept the house, raised the children, managed the finances, held everything together, and then believed I had nothing to offer outside of that context, that I was the supporting structure, not the house. I know other women who have lived some version of this. Not all the same. Nothing is ever all the same, but the shape of it, the particular way you stop taking up space in your own life. I recognize it when I see it now. I didn't always. Walter and I have not spoken since the settlement. Jennifer manages whatever needs to be managed. He's moved into a smaller place. I know this only incidentally. I don't ask. I find that I have very little feeling about it either way, which surprised me. I expected residual attachment or residual bitterness, but mostly I feel the way you feel when you finally fix a drafty window you'd lived with for years. You stop noticing the cold. You forget you were ever cold. I'm not going to tell you this is a story about justice, exactly. Justice would have looked like not needing a recording from my granddaughter to get a fair hearing. Justice would have looked like a lot of things that didn't happen. What I'll call it instead is this: true. It happened. The recording was real. The conversation was real. Nora, in her coat with her scratched phone and her cartoon cat sticker, standing in front of a judge, was real, and she was 12 years old. And she stood up in a room full of adults and said someone has to say something, and then said it. I don't have a tidy conclusion for you. I'm working on the drawing and the tax law and the condo that still smells a little like fresh paint in the study. I'm calling my friends back, the ones I let drift, the ones who are more patient than I deserved. One of them is coming to visit next month. We're planning to drive up to Lake Erie for a few days. I haven't been to Lake Erie since 1987. I'm very much looking forward to it. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this ended. Not in any cosmic sense. I'm not a person who leans on the idea that the universe balances its own books. But I do think that what we choose to do and what we choose not to do compounds over time the way interest compounds. Slowly at first, invisibly, and then all at once. Walter made choices for decades, small ones and large ones. He chose to move money quietly. He chose to file before I understood what I was owed. He chose in 100 smaller ways across 41 years to treat my presence in his life as something he was entitled to rather than something worth honouring. Each of those choices felt, I'm sure, like nothing much in the moment. That's how it works. The damage isn't in the big moments. It's in the accumulation of all the small ones you tell yourself don't count. And I made choices too. I chose to ask permission for things that were already mine. I chose to let friendships go because maintaining them required more energy than I had left over after managing Walter's moods. I chose to stop wanting things. Not all at once, never all at once, but steadily until wanting things felt like a habit I'd simply outgrown. I told myself that was maturity. I was wrong. That was erosion. What I've come to understand is that character, real character, not the performed kind, is built in the private moments when no one is watching and nothing is at stake yet. Nora understood something at 12 that I had spent decades avoiding, that knowing the truth and staying silent is its own kind of decision. She sat in that den doing her homework, heard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear, and spent 6 months carrying it carefully until she found the right moment. She didn't act rashly. She didn't act out of anger. She acted out of a quiet, precise sense that someone she loved was being treated unfairly, and that she happened to be the one who knew it. That's not something you can teach in a classroom. That's what courage actually looks like when it's not performing for anyone. A 12-year-old in a coat with a scratched phone, standing up straight in a room full of adults saying, I have something important, and I'm going to say it. I think about the version of myself at 22, the one with the job offer and the apartment and the plan. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't naive. She just hadn't yet learned to negotiate herself down to nothing. I'm trying to find my way back to her, not to pretend the years in between didn't happen, because they did. And Jennifer and the grandchildren came from those years, and I wouldn't undo that. But to remember that she existed, that I existed before I became useful to someone else's life. The drawing table in my study is still there. I'm still mediocre at drawing. I'm still having a wonderful time. If there's anything I'd want someone to take from this, it's just that. Don't confuse being needed with being valued. Don't let the years of showing up for someone else convince you that you have nothing left to offer yourself. And if you happen to have a granddaughter who sits very quietly in rooms where adults are talking, maybe pay attention to what she's paying attention to. She probably sees more than you think.